Hello, everyone. Today I bring you a follow-up to the last couple of presentations I've given on work from Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History. Today in this presentation I'll be looking at part 3, or the Groves of Civilizations. Chapter 9, Arrested Civilizations. In this chapter, Toynbee surveys civilizations that have come into existence but do not achieve sufficient growth. They therefore make it further than the abortive civilizations, but not as far as the developed civilizations. He terms these the arrested civilizations, and he divides them into two groups. The first group overcame a challenge from the physical environment, which are the Polynesians, Eskimos, and nomads. The other group overcame a challenge of the physical environment, which are the Ottomans and the Spartans. Toynbee argues that each of these civilizations achieved a tour de force, an accomplishment so strenuous that it permanently crippled their development. For example, the Polynesians made the accomplishment of open sea voyages to explore and settle the islands of the Pacific. However, they then became isolated amongst their various islands until Western explorers discovered them. The Eskimos' accomplishment was their ingenuity in adapting to the conditions of the Arctic, but they would become slaves to the harsh climate, and its extreme conditions would stunt their development. The nomads include such peoples as the Arabs, the Scythians, Turks, and Mongols, and the main accomplishment was adapting to the desiccation of the Eurasian steppe. There were two ways in which this was achieved. Some nomadic groups became farmers and migrated on a seasonal basis around the steppe, whilst others became shepherds, cultivating large herds of livestock, which they would take with them. The nomads, like the Eskimos, become slaves of their climate and as a result, never develop a sedentary culture. Furthermore, when the nomadic and the sedentary people clash, if the former encroached on sedentary lands, this is because their nomadic domain had become so desiccated as to no longer provide sufficient sustenance. Toynbee illustrates this with a biblical analogy by drawing on the story of Cain and Abel. The sedentary Abel is slain by the nomadic Cain. The most striking case of this would be the conquest of the Turks and Mongols. However, there are cases where the sedentary people intrude upon the lands of the nomads, such as the expansion of Russia into the Eurasian steppe. With Western dominance of the whole globe, the end of nomadic civilizations was to come, except for a few isolated cases. The Ottomans' accomplishment was the conquest of a large sedentary empire. However, they would become shepherds of human cattle. The Ottomans were not the first nomadic empire to experience this phenomenon, as we can see from the case of the Avars in the 6th century. However, where in the steppe environment there is mutually beneficial relationship between shepherd and cattle, this is not the case for the nomadic empire, as the shepherds become an unproductive ruling elite who extract from their productive human subjects. Toynbee notes that Ibn Khaldun's assessment of empires as lasting only a few generations was informed by his observation of various nomadic peoples, such as the Arabs and Turks, whose states would collapse on this manner. The Parthians who ruled Iran and the Mongols who ruled China lasted longer than usual for about 200 to 300 years. The Ottomans were proved to be the truly exceptional by exceeding 400 years. They would accomplish this by establishing a universal state for Greek Orthodox world, as well as creating and adapting human auxiliaries in the form of the Janissaries and the Mamluks. The Janissaries served as human watchdogs to maintain order, but after free Muslims were allowed to enter their ranks, the institution became corrupted and resulted in the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Sultan Mahmud II would eventually put down the human watchdogs in 1826, as did his Egyptian subject Mehmed Ali with the Mamluks. The Spartans' accomplishment was their ability to conquer and dominate their Mycenaean neighbours. However, like the Eskimos, their triumph is their curse, and after two wars with the Mycenaeans in 736 to 720 BC and 650 to 620 BC, the Spartans would be bound to forever holding down their Helot subjects. The Spartan agoge or military education was similar to the Ottoman devashirme, in that it was designed to fashion high quality soldiers, albeit the Spartan was a free citizen. Like the Janissaries, they would act as watchdogs over the subject Helots. The main fault of the Spartan system is that it is inhibitive to the creative arts and culture. The vast majority of works from ancient Sparta are either made before the 6th century BC or after the abolition of the agoge in 189 to 188 BC. Toynbee identifies two features of an arrested civilization: that of the division of its members into castes, which are then specialized for specific functions. This inflexible nature sets these civilizations onto a retrogressive path. Furthermore, he compares the arrested civilizations to a utopia, such as the state set out in Plato's Republic or the society of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. The purpose of these social systems and utopias is to establish equilibrium and order. Toynbee likens the Roman Empire under the five good emperors from 98 AD to 180 AD to the arrested civilizations as the ruling class resembled Plato's philosopher kings. Though the society was orderly, it had ceased to be culturally productive and in a mode of stasis. Chapter 10: The Nature of the Growths of Civilizations. In this chapter, Toynbee begins by recapping that a civilization can only grow through a golden mean of challenge, whereby the pressure is not too great nor too easy. However, as in the case of the arrested civilizations, the tour de force that a civilization achieves from overcoming a challenge needs to generate enough momentum for them to overcome further challenges so the cycle can repeat itself to ensure a constant stream of growth. He gives an example by looking at the Hellenic civilization after the destruction of its parent Minoan civilization, whereupon the majority were scattered into many disorganized village communities. They responded to the challenge by establishing cities and agriculture. However, this response led to another challenge as the population of the cities grew to beyond what their agriculture could sustain. There are two different responses to the challenge of overpopulation. The first solution was to colonize the Mediterranean through establishing cities in mainland Italy, Sicily, and Libya. However, this in itself represented a challenge to the non-Hellenic peoples, who responded by halting the creation of further polis during the 6th century BC. The other solution to overpopulation was the Athenian response, which Toynbee outlines in the introduction. Toynbee breaks down the pattern of growth into two categories, that of the macrocosm or progressive mastery of the external environment and microcosm or progressive mastery of self-determination and self-articulation. The former he breaks down into progressive mastery of the human environment, which is measured as a geographical extension of the society, and the progressive mastery of the non-human environment, which is expressed as mastery of a technique. Toynbee first discusses the mastery of the human environment and stipulates that geographical extension is not the same as painting the map red, and that large-scale military conquest is a sign of decline, as this shows that militarism has taken over the society. This is ultimately a suicidal path in which a civilization's destruction is the only result. Toynbee points out that the classical age, or the period from the Persian Wars in the early 5th century BC up to the time of Alexander the Great, was a period of growth despite the Hellenic society's physical expansion was limited to a large hostile powers like the Persians and Carthaginians. The Hellenic society, after overcoming this challenge, would expand under Alexander and his successors to parts of Asia, and under the Romans would stretch over parts of Western and Northern Europe. However, it was during these centuries that the process of disintegration had begun. Furthermore, the expansion of a civilization results in the deterioration of quality. For example, the Minoan civilization had begun to produce inferior quality pottery over a wider geographical distribution around the time of its collapse in the 15th century BC. Toynbee then turns to discussing the mastery of the physical environment through improvement in technique. Firstly, he argues that the development of an advanced technique does not necessarily lead to growth. For example, each of the previously mentioned arrested civilizations had pioneered a form of human specialization, but this in itself did not prevent the civilizations from becoming static. Technique can even improve whilst the civilization declines, as can be seen with the shift from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic age. In the former, humans produced a rudimentary form of art through cave drawings, whilst the latter had more advanced tools were completely devoid of any art whatsoever. The improvement of military technique can also take place alongside decline, as each successive innovation is spurred on by an event that instigates decline. The creation of the Greek hoplite, which then developed into the two divergent paths, that of the pikeman and the peltasts, which then become synthesized in the Roman legionary, which then is perfected through the civil wars and revolutions of the late Roman Republic. Another technique whose improvement corresponds to the civilization's decline is agriculture. In the Hellenic civilization, there was some initial growth when the move was made from. However, after the move was made from the specialized agriculture to plantation slavery, there was serious civilizational decline as the creation of mass industrial farming drove many rural farmers into the cities who became urban proletariat. This new underclass ate away like a social cancer in which no reforms could adequately assuage. The plantation system itself collapsed after the breakdown of economy in the last stages of the empire. Mixed farming to specialized agriculture for export. We then come to cases of where there is no improvement in technique, but a society advances or declines. In the former, we have the example of the transition from the lower to upper Paleolithic age, where we have the evolution of the Neanderthals to Homo sapiens. This human progress was accomplished despite Homo sapiens utilizing the same standard of technique as the Neanderthals. Conversely, in the transition from the Minoan society to the Hellenic and the Hellenic to the Western, the improvements in technique are retained in spite of two dissolutions of the universal states and their ensuing societal relapses. Toynbee concludes that the improvement of technique is not a sufficient cause of growth within a civilization, but it does display a principle of how technical progress is achieved. He coins the term etherealization to describe how, as technical progress increases efficiency, energy which is bound up in the lower physical plane is released into the upper ethereal plane. The criterion for growth is found in the change of emphasis and the shifting of the scene of action. Challenge and response plays out now in an internal microcosm rather than external macrocosm, as problems arise from within a society. For example, the Western society created the feudal system to resist the external threat posed by the Vikings. However, in the next stage of Western history, the feudal order has imposed a strain on the society which culminated in the mission to replace this system of relations between social classes with that of the relations between the state and the individual. If we look at the Hellenic civilization, we can see a similar trend whereby, after overcoming the external threats of the barbarians, Carthaginians, and Persians, the civilization was plagued by a series of internal dilemmas. Firstly, after being victorious in the Persian Wars, the Hellenic world encountered its first breakdown after the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. We then have a turn towards external threats of Alexander's campaigns, and a final turn towards the internal again with the Roman conquest of the Greek world. Rome's civil wars and the social religious conflict between Hellenized Oriental slaves and their Greco-Roman masters. The course of Western history is not too dissimilar after seeing a series of external challenges, including the Muslims in Iberia, the Vikings, and later the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottomans were overcome, the Western civilization has expanded to all corners of the globe. Toynbee ponders the threat the Soviet Union could pose to the West and ultimately concludes that the spread of Marxism and the Western industrial techniques to Russia, this actually represents a triumph of Western civilization over Russian civilization. A similar example can be seen in India, where despite the efforts of Gandhi to achieve Indian independence, this was ultimately accomplished in a Western mould. India was to be a parliamentary democracy, complete with elections, campaigns, and mass media. In respect of an internal challenge to the Western civilization, this manifests in the social ills that were a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, which was the Western civilization's way of mastering the physical environment. The response to these social ills was the creation of democracy as a method of mass management. Toynbee concludes that the twin forces of industrialism and democracy are the most important social forces in the development of the Western civilization. Chapter 11: An Analysis of Growth. Toynbee rearticulates the growth of a civilization is achieved through the self-articulation of individuals that belong to it. The question is, what is the relationship between the two? Is society just a collection of atomized individuals, or is it one whole in which individuals are part of? He rejects both answers. The former because he declares that man is a social animal and does not function in an atomized manner. He refutes the latter because the analogy is deterministic and specifically criticizes Oswald Spengler's assertion that civilizations function like organisms. Toynbee ultimately concludes that a civilization is the product of relations between individuals within the civilization as a whole. The civilization forms a field of action in which all the individuals are the source of all action. Toynbee then draws on the thought of philosopher Henri Bergson and argues that the massive individuals themselves are not the source of growth, but a select creative few. These exceptional individuals attempt to replicate themselves onto the rest of the members of a civilization. These can be resisted and the exceptional individuals can become ostracized. However, if they succeed in transfiguring the social milieu, then those who don't adapt become the ostracized. Toynbee concludes that disturbances in social equilibrium can be amended. However, this can't be accomplished by encouraging every individual to be creative, as this simply isn't possible. He draws a distinction between the creative minority and the uncreative mass. He argues that despite the creation of great religions and the new social forces of industrialism and democracy, most people don't actively engage with these in the same way their creators did. If we think back to our primitive and civilized societies, the latter is growing because it possesses a creative minority, whereas the former does not. Another difference is that in the former, there is a veneration of the previous generations, whilst in the latter, Toynbee notes there is what he terms mimesis, whereby the uncreative mass follow the lead of the creative minority. We then come to the concept of withdrawal and return. Toynbee uses this phrase to describe the process by which an individual within the creative minority withdraws from the rest of the civilization, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. The individual undergoes a metaphysical transfiguration whereby they discover newfound powers or an understanding of how to transform their civilization for the better. They then return, and the uncreative mass become followers and partake in mimesis. An example of this is Moses journeying to Mount Sinai and his return with the Ten Commandments. Toynbee also utilizes the analogy of Plato's cave to explain withdrawal and return. The individual who leaves the darkness of the cave becomes aware of the true reality outside the cave and then returns to persuade the other cave dwellers to also venture out. Other notable figures Toynbee uses as an example of withdrawal and return are Saint Paul, Saint Benedict, Saint Gregory, Buddha, Muhammad, Machiavelli, and Dante. Toynbee then describes several examples of withdrawal and return when applied to several creative minorities collectively in history. The first example is that of Athens in the Hellenic society, who had withdrawn from the wider Hellenic geopolitics during the period from the 7th century BC until the early 5th century BC. The city had refined her culture and institutions in response to the challenge of overpopulation, which has been discussed previously. Her return to the geopolitical arena during the Persian Wars instigated the classical era of the Hellenic world, and she would be influential for at least the next two centuries. Next, we come to the Italian city-states in the latter Middle Ages from 1250 to 1494 AD. The Renaissance allowed the city-states to create wonderful art, architecture, and literature as they were isolated from the rest of Europe thanks to the Alps, and collapse of the power of the Holy Roman Emperors meant there was no foreign interventions or meddling. The cultural development eventually spread to the other Western powers, so every state became Italianized, and as these states controlled much larger territory, they were able to replicate the benefits on a much grander scale. We then come to Britain in the early modern period, roughly from 1500 AD to the present. Toynbee argues that England, Switzerland, and the Netherlands all attempted to respond to the challenge of absolutism by withdrawing into representative nation-states. England would ultimately prove the most successful, as her geographic position as an island gave her an isolation and security from continental threats more so than the Swiss and the Dutch. Furthermore, her history as a united centralised kingdom with Parliament as a representative institution was able to create what Toynbee terms a city-state writ large. From this position, England was able to innovate and spawn the social forces of industrialism and democracy as a response to the challenge of becoming Italianized. Toynbee ends the chapter by opining on what Russia's role is to be in Western history. As stated previously, the former is now part of the latter, and any conflict is an internal schism in the Western civilization, rather than in civilizational clash with another culture. Chapter 12. Differentiation through growth. Toynbee summarizes that growth is accomplished through the process of challenge and response. This first plays out externally by challenges in the external physical world and is later followed by challenges from within. This leads to a rise of the creative minority who go through withdrawal and return to further the growth of their civilization by influencing the uncreative mass through mimesis. Even though all civilizations grow, they develop differently. For example, each civilization develops its own distinctive art style and moral character. Toynbee again criticises Spengler by accusing him of engaging in fantasy for overly relying on hard differences between civilizations in his analysis. Thank you all for listening to this presentation.